generation to generation in the church, and in Christ Jesus forever and ever. Amen.
It was nice to see you guys. We wander into chapter 6 in the Gospel of Mark today. Last week we talked about chapter 5. At the end of chapter 5, you may recall. We were mostly talking about the woman who had been ill for 12 years, right? And then the young girl who was 12 years old. Yeah, and the link between those, both being symbolically beloved children of God. So that's not yet adults, if you will, in the faith. I just put my Margaret Whitlock sermon into my... Glad I found that. I would have been looking for that later. Yeah. And it would never, like 10 years later, well, that's where that went, and it would have been too late. So, wow. God is good. So today, so any reflections before we move into chapter 6 from last week? All right, great. Let's go. Chapter 6. We'll just read this. Jesus is going home now. And he had just performed 2 miracles, and one was on a woman who was a Gentile from Caesarea Philippi, who was trembling but also believed in the power of Jesus to heal her. Well-educated person, and this child, right? Beloved to a father, 12 years old, who Jesus possibly raises from the dead, or certainly heals from a terminal illness. And now you have to remember, right? So this is big. Well, this is big news. This would be big news anywhere. This was big news then. And so Jesus is like, the word was always going out in front of him. Right? People were hearing about him before he showed up. And now he goes home. He goes back to Nazareth. And you have to remember, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but they have a memory of who this guy is. I mean, they have a memory of Jesus coming home when he's a little kid, having lived for 7, 8, 9 years maybe in Alexandria, Egypt. He's come home. He's an odd little kid. They remembered the story, possibly, of the angels that had visited Joseph and Mary, one in a dream and one in real life right there in Nazareth. And so now so the pieces are all dropping into place, right? The story, the experience they had of young Jesus when he came back, probably a nice kid, maybe a little different than the other kids, I would guess. But probably never really an outsider, right? A deep insider, in fact, because that's the nature of God. And then he goes away, and now they hear this. And here he comes, and he shows up at home. So let's pick up now Jesus showing up in Nazareth. Does somebody want to read chapter 6, verses 1 through 6?
He left there and returned to his hometown. His disciples came along. On the Sabbath, he gave a lecture in the meeting place. He made a real hit, impressing everyone. We had no idea he was this good, they said. How did he get so wise all of a sudden? Get such ability? But in the next breath, they were cutting him down. He's just a carpenter, Mary's boy. We've known him since he was a kid. We know his brothers, James, Justus, Jude, and Simon, and his sisters. Who does he think he is? They tripped over what little they knew about him and fell sprawling, and they never got any further. Jesus told them a prophet has little honor in his hometown among his relatives on the streets he played in as a child. Jesus wasn't able to do much of anything there. He laid hands on a few sick people and healed them. That's all. He couldn't get over their stubbornness. He left and made a circuit of the other villages teaching.
So let me guess. The Message.
Right. Yes. Sorry, should I have used the other?
We'll read the other in a second. So there is so much author interpretation in that. Read it. It's super interesting, right? So sort of where he splices like the division. Read verses 2 and 3 again out of the Message. Hey, Mary. If are they even marked as verses?
They're not.
Okay, so read where did this man get all this wisdom? Read that, starting with that wisdom sentence.
We had no idea what he was this good. How did he get so wise all of a sudden, get such ability? But in the next.
Stop. So what the author did here is he made a break that I wouldn't have made, right? And I'm not sure, so this is his transition from Jesus the extraordinary to Jesus, not a great guy that we're not going to believe. And so we're going to talk about that exact break, because there is a break here. I wouldn't put it here. Eugene Peterson did. So read the next sentence. But
in the next breath, they were cutting him down.
Okay, so one thing you always have to remember, that when you read in the Bible, it is very interpretive, right? And it has been translated, and there is people's opinions that are tied into it. So the beauty of that Bible, Eugene Peterson's The Message. Has anyone ever read out of that?
Yeah.
It flows so sort of wonderfully like a story, right? I mean, there's a real cadence to it that Peterson has captured, and I think generally it's a really good interpretation. But it is written for the flow of the narrative, right? So does anybody have like a different translation in NRSV maybe? Diane?
He left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue.
So what did yours say about the synagogue?
The meeting place.
He instructed in the meeting place,
Yes,
as opposed
the
to
lecture in the meeting place.
lecture in the meeting place, teaching in the synagogue. So those are super different things.
Yes.
Super
Yes.
different things. Go on.
And many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph, and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense.
So now you see the break is different. The break comes after the family teaching. In Eugene Peterson's, it came before the family. In the NRSV, it came after the family. There's a difference in that then. Go on, Dan.
Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house. And he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief."
So it's really interesting. So Helen, let's read your second sentence where it said on the Sabbath day, or on right at the beginning when you went into the meeting place to instruct them. Read that sentence again.
He made a real hit, impressing everyone. We had no idea he was this good, they said. How did he get so wise all of a sudden?
Back up to right near the beginning.
He left there and returned to his hometown. His disciples came along. On the Sabbath, he gave a lecture in the meeting place. He made a real hit, impressing everyone. We had no idea he was this good, they said.
Awesome. So let's just hold it there for a minute.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things about studying the Bible is the secrets of the words that come to us from the text, right? And they make connection for us. So I'll give you an example of that. When we look at, for those of you that have a Bible that has the verses in it, when you look at verse 2 here, on the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. That word "many" is a really important word for us, and so is that word synagogue, right? And there's the reasons those are really important is the many is not just a bunch of folks that came around, but it's a really specific word that they found used very frequently for the gathering of the faithful people in the Qumran texts that they found in the Qumran caves. Now the Qumran caves were populated by what type of Jew? Orthodox for sure.
Yeah.
The Essenes.
The Essenes.
Right? So the Essenes. So that's a clue to the translator, the interpreter, that the community in Nazareth has some similarities in how they gather and how they consider the faithful as the Essene community in the caves of Qumran. Another clue that we find is the synagogue. So Nazareth is a really tiny town, and Nazareth doesn't have a rabbi. at this point. And we think they don't. We'll see. Maybe they do. But the interesting thing about Nazareth having a synagogue is that there's what's that town near it? Jairus? Within a short walking distance is a much bigger town that does have a synagogue. So under regular circumstances, the people from Nazareth would just walk over to the bigger synagogue in the bigger city. But there's some reason that they think they need their own synagogue, and that the synagogue in the bigger city that's nearby is not okay for them. So then the question is, why do they need their own synagogue, and why aren't they going to go to the more conventional or the bigger one in the town nearby? Right, so these words then begin to ask us questions about the town that Jesus is coming home to, right? Populated by Essenes. If they're populated by Essenes, that tells us a little bit about what they believe about angels.
Are you saying that they did not have a synagogue?
They did have a synagogue. The question is, why would a little town have a synagogue, right? Because practically speaking, most towns don't have little synagogues, and or most towns don't have synagogues. So it was a big effort for a little town to have its own synagogue. It was expensive, and it means it was a big focus of the community. And so the question then is, why would this little town think they needed one when, practically speaking, they'd walk over the hill like everybody else did? So why would this little town need a synagogue instead of just going over the hill?
Their belief system is a little different.
That's exactly right. Right? They don't like those heretics over there, and we're going to put the money and the time, and we need our own little way of teaching, right? To keep it pure. Right? So this Essene community, or Essene-esque community that we get from the hint of how the many gather, and that they have their own little synagogue. Says something about the orthodoxy or the militancy or that this is a pretty conservative, strict little town that has pretty tight beliefs about what it means to be Jewish. And Jesus is walking into this. You with me? It's pretty cool, huh? Right? So anyway, they come, and so when Jesus shows up, how do they respond? Right? He's back. He's back. He's come home. Who is he? Who is Jesus?
Our son.
Our son. Who else? Like, who might he be?
He's Mary's son.
He's Mary's son, but
Brothers?
rabbi? Well, he is a rabbi, right? So that's a good point. So if they have a synagogue that's looking for a rabbi, their rabbis come home, right? So. Right. So here he comes, and he's also the son of a carpenter. Now, how was Joseph, jumping around a little bit here, but typical, right, of this class? I'm sorry. What's your picture or vision of Joseph? The carpenter in Nazareth.
An apron with a hammer in his hand.
An apron with a hammer in his hand, right?
Yeah, he's a humble man.
A humble man. Why do you say that? Okay.
Smart.
Smart guy. Why do you say that?
Because carpenters were regarded as higher echelon, educated and smart.
They were the tech guys
They were the Boeing engineers, Ron.
Exactly.
They were the guys that
You need to
measure. They knew how to make stuff, right? They were really bright. There's a little story in the Talmud, which is a sort of a exegesis on the Old Testament for the Jewish community. And the Talmud has this little story. It says a man comes to a village seeking to solve a problem, and he asks for the rabbi, but none were there. So he asks for a carpenter. Or the son of a carpenter. Right? That's sort of the pecking order. Right? You got a rabbi, and if you don't have a rabbi to answer the questions, then you go to the carpenter. And the carpenter's there. So when they say this thing in here, oh, isn't he the son of the carpenter? They're not like saying, oh, what a schmo, just the son of a carpenter. They're saying he's the son of the carpenter, right? Like he's the guy who knows some stuff. So he's invited. He's seen as a leader. People have heard about what he's able to do. He's the son of the carpenter, right? So he's got to be a bright guy, and they invite him in to the synagogue to begin to teach. And the many gathered, and they are astounded. Where did he get all of this? Now that's an interesting question. Where did he get all of this? Well, where didn't he get it?
At home.
Didn't he get it at home? That's right, Tom, right? He didn't get it there. They know that. Did he get it from Joseph? No. Now, why do we know he didn't get it from Joseph? Because they would have known. Where did he get all this? Well, he got it from Joseph. Why are you asking? No. So I think there's sometimes a myth or a misperception, at least to my mind, that Jesus grew up and trained as a carpenter. I don't think there's any reason to believe that from the text. What?
Well, one of the points though was that he was so wise at the when they went back to visit, and he went up and talked to the rabbis, and he was smarter than they were.
Yes.
Or at least as smart.
So yeah, when he was 12 years old, remember how old he was? 12.
Yeah.
Because he was 12, we know he was what? A child. Because we've seen that number now 3 times in the Bible, right? 12 years bleeding, beloved child of God, 12-year-old girl, 12-year-old little boy Jesus. And when Mary says, let's go, do you think he could have stayed there with the rabbis at the temple? Sure he could have. Are you kidding me, man? These are the rabbis in the temple in Jerusalem, and they're saying, hey, we would like your boy who's 12, almost a man, right, by our definition, to stay. Do you think they could have said, we're going to sort of change the rules for this guy because he's extraordinary? But Jesus is the one that says he's going to abide by where he is in his life. And that means going home with his mom. So he goes home with mom. But your point is really important, Helen, and it's a good point, because Jesus was seen by the top of the top scholars in Judaism in the world at the time. And why were they so impressed by him? What did he do that impressed them? You guys remember that?
Didn't he say something about he got this from his father?
Well, no, I think one of the things that they were impressed. So let's turn to it.
His knowledge?
What?
Wasn't it his knowledge, and he was speaking beyond his years?
Well, let's flip to it. Let's see what it says. Where is it? It's in the Bible, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's Luke chapter 2. Verse 47. Please do. I'd say 40. Let's see.
47.
Just a second.
Chapter 2, verse
The next day they found him in the
Yeah, maybe 45. Yeah, 45. Verse 45, chapter 2. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Shula.
Starting with when they did not.
Yep.
When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Do you not know that I must be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and was obedient to them.
See,
His mother treasured all
these things in her heart. So he made the decision to be obedient to the system, how it was organized. Tom, you're right. It was his answers and his understanding that amazed them. So back now to the carpenter, chapter 6 in Mark. So they say, where did he get all of this wisdom? They know now. If he had gotten it from his dad and had he studied with his dad and worked over there and hammered stones over there in the next village, building it up, they would have correlated, right? Of course he's as smart because he's the son of Joseph, but he had an additional wisdom that they didn't see. Now, you all have heard me talked about the education of, right? When Jesus was 12 or 13, I'm certain, probably 13, when Jesus was 13, he was snapped up by a rabbi and he went out to study. So he had been gone out of Nazareth from age 13 until he returns right here. Right?
When you say snapped out, is that when
Let me say it a different way.
no, I mean when they recognized what was going on and they knew that he needed more education, sort of thing, and is that when he went down to Egypt?
No. So Jesus went to Egypt when Herod came into Bethlehem to kill all of the little children, and Joseph was warned in a dream, and he went down, and they were down there for quite a long time.
Yeah.
So this is the thing. Remember the storyline on this. So they go down to Egypt. They're in Egypt for a long time. Now they didn't text the guys in Nazareth to let them know where they were, right? I mean, they were gone, and they went from Nazareth, which is 100 to 120 people, teeny town, right, to Alexandria, Egypt, center of the intellectual world, right? Biggest library in the world. Jesus, pretty bright little kid, probably highly attuned to the context to which he was in. Can you imagine? He could have come back there at age, he could have left there when they finally came back to Nazareth at age 8 or 9, speaking a couple languages, knowing to read these books, having been exposed to some of the greatest rabbis, because there was a big Jewish community down there, right? So when he picks up and in a dream, again, Joseph is called back, and they're going to go back to Jerusalem, but then they get sidetracked and they go back to Nazareth. When he arrives, the other kids look at him like, where did this kid come from, right? What language does he speak? What things has he seen? What books has he read? And at this point, he knows the Bible by heart cold. So at age 13, the structure is all the little boys learn the Bible by heart, probably between ages of 6 and 8. They learn the Torah. Then the brighter boys stay on and learn the rest, the prophets and the Psalms. And then occasionally there's a super bright kid that gets drafted by a rabbi, if you will. And they literally go and live with the rabbi. And they live with the rabbi for 15 years or so. And they learn everything the rabbi knows. And this is how schools of rabbinical thought are passed down over time. Right? So the idea is Jesus would have gone off with a rabbi. He would have studied with this rabbi every single thing the rabbi knows and the way the rabbi lives and how the rabbi moves in the world. And then he's ordained a rabbi himself and goes and gets a Torah and goes and finds an empty synagogue and he starts teaching in the town. Right? So then he starts his own school, right? And that's how the tradition was passed on. So when Jesus comes back here, they probably haven't seen Jesus since he was 13 years old. And he went off to live with the rabbi. Now they have an empty building here, don't they? And they have somebody who they knew as a little kid, and they know the backstory about him because they're Essenes, and Essenes believe in angels, and they believe in conversations with angels. And so if you back it into the story of Mary and Joseph both talking with angels, I always imagine that was a known story in the community, not a secret story. Because angels were a part of the Essene community, which is why this word, the many, is important, right? Tying us to Qumran, tying us to Essenes, bringing us back to Nazareth. So he's coming home. He's coming home. He's got the Torah. He is a rabbi. He's wildly well educated. They have a prophetic idea that he might be the Messiah. And if he's the Messiah, and he's the Messiah in the synagogue there in Nazareth, what does that mean for everybody in town? Hello, center of the world. Right? Center of the world. Because the Messiah is going to rule the world. He's the Messiah. He's been healing everybody all over the place. Smartest guy, wisest guy they've ever seen. We know him. Don't we know his siblings? Who are his siblings? Right? Don't we know him? Right? James and Jose, Joseph.
Justice, Jude, and Simon.
and Simon and his sister. So now this is where it gets funky. Excited, the Messiah, capable, teaching in the synagogue. They know his family. He is theirs. He will rule from here. And they're this closed little community, right? That has their own synagogue, like their own little way of doing it. And he is now going to be at the center of that. And the first ring of that, of course, is who? His family. The second ring is his extended family that lives there in Nazareth with him. So then something happens. Right? Something breaks down. Right? A crime has been committed. But let's talk about the family before we talk about the crime that Jesus commits between the sentence on the family and the rejection by the community. Okay? So what do you make of all these brothers and sisters? What's that about?
Joseph's kids?
Yeah, they're not Mary's kids. You know, I bet James is older than Mary.
They're not Mary's kids.
Well, so there's a couple of things about that, right? So let's do the timeline again, Mary, right? So they go down, either these kids, they go down to Egypt. Let's say Jesus is Mary and Joseph's first child. They go down to Egypt. They're down there for quite a while. They come back up. Jesus is 8, 9 years old. Then they have 4 more kids, plus a couple of daughters, 7 kids. So one of these kids, when Jesus shows up back in the town, is still an infant, right? But Joseph's not in the picture anymore, is he? So what the proto-evangelist of James says, which is a book written sort of about the family of Mary, is that Joseph was a widow with children, and Mary came to help him care for those children when Jesus was conceived. Right? So these kids are older. So at this point, they could be a lot older. Right? I mean, it's conceivable that if there's 7 or 8 of them, some of them are probably maybe even older than Mary. Right? So we have these. What?
No wonder his first wife died. Sorry.
Hell, that's terrible.
And if Mary was an Essene, she wouldn't have had children anyway.
Yeah, right. I mean,
Oh, really?
so Essenes believed in celibacy, right? So celibacy was a big virtue within the Essene community. Another clue, right? So the fact that she would come and sort of adopt those kids, right? That is sort of in line with what Essenes did. They were big in adopting. So the fact that God gave them a child, Joseph would adopt that child, even though he wasn't the father, because that was the son of God, as told to him by an angel, and given birth to by his betrothed. So right now, so Jesus comes back. He's the youngest here. He's got all of his older brothers and sisters there to greet him. And then what happens? Right? And the shift here, if you will, from verse 3 and to this point, and are not his sisters here with us, break, and they took offense at him.
Who's the they?
The community, the many.
Or the brothers and sisters?
It's a good question. It's a good question. So, what do you think? Why would it be one? Make an argument for it being the siblings, and then make an argument for it being the community. You want to do that?
The siblings may be jealous.
Siblings may be jealous of him,
His power and
his charisma, right? All right. So, how about the village? Why would they be upset?
It's too radical for them.
He's putting on airs.
Right? Too radical, too inclusive for their conservative views. That's right. One commentator I read talked about is this, we see in the Gospel of Luke, they do the same thing, right? Jesus goes and he teaches in the synagogue and he tells a little story from the Gospel of Isaiah, and then they love him, and then he tells a story about Haman the general from Syria and the widow of Zarephath, and they weren't Jews, they were Gentiles, and they were included in God's kingdom, and then they want to kill Jesus, right? in Gospel of Mark, it's different. So first of all, we don't know what he read, and he doesn't tell that story. But the offense here seems to be against the family unit. So for whatever reason, he didn't fit in with the authority of his older brother James, which could cause offense, or he didn't fit in with the community's view of who he was and how he should act, right? So the crime or the dislocation comes in a familial break here, which is why I would argue that the tension here comes after they say his relationship with the family is here. But I guess you probably could interpret it either way. So
Wasn't James, though, didn't he choose James to be one of the disciples?
not this James. This James.
I always thought it was his brother. Okay.
No, right. But James then does become the leader of the Christian community in Jerusalem, and he was later martyred. Right. So he was a wildly well-respected man, and he also followed Jesus. Clearly, right? So the question is, if it is James and his brothers that are mad at Jesus, when did they reconcile? And we don't see that in the text anywhere. The community is the one that tries to kill him in the Gospel of Luke. So I would argue that the community was the one that was very angry at Jesus in this case, because that would be consistent with what we see in the Gospel of Mark. Because he is rejecting them, right, and their orthodoxy and their city as the center of this new messianic world transformation. What do you think? You with me? A little bit? So that is a little bit about that first little section. Any questions on that before we move into this prophet Tom?
In the New Oxford, they've got a note where it says, and they took offense at him. They've got a note, or stumbled. That doesn't make sense to me.
The stumbling?
Well, it says, and they took offense at him, or stumbled, which means to me, and he stumbled.
Well, what they may mean there, I don't know, but what they may mean is that
That's all they give.
they stumble over his teachings, or there's something about what he's saying is a stumbling block for them.
In here, they tripped over what little they knew about him and fell sprawling, and they got no further. So
Same connotation, right? Same
Yeah.
kind of.
Just emotionally, it was a stumbling block. Is that what
Yeah,
you
yeah.
mean?
yeah.
You see, you have to remember the anticipation of him coming was huge. They knew him, he'd been gone, they heard about him, they heard what he did, then he shows up, and they expect him to do one thing, and he does another thing. He doesn't fall in line with his family's position and birth, probably doesn't fall in line with what the community expects him to do. His teachings don't fall in line with the orthodoxy of that little synagogue that they hold so dear. And then they're pretty angry. And then, let's read on. And they took offense at him. And Jesus said, prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown and among their own kin and at their own house. So, what do you think of that?
He's humbling himself in some way.
Yeah, humbling himself.
Could explain that it's not just the community, it's also his family that he's at odds with.
That's true. Could explain that he's at odds with his family too.
It's like at work, when an outside consultant comes in and says something, we go, oh. But when someone from within the organization says the same sort of thing, it's like, no, that'll never work, or that's no. That dynamic that happens.
Same things with your kids.
Yeah.
They'll hear it from the teacher, but if they hear it from you, it doesn't have the same weight as it does from the teacher.
Right. I mean, think about, like, even growing, when we gather, when the Kahn family gathers at my parents' house, like, we sort of fall back into a lot of those, like, little quirky things, like the thing that you did when you were like 8, you're still doing, and you're 52 or something, and like you can sort of fall into these patterns of family behavior that sort of can, I don't know, and all the family baggage and the family's expectations and what they think. Like you have all of that stuff. You know what I'm talking about, Bill? Right?
I was at dinner with my sister last night. I know what you mean.
Right, exactly. Older sister?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I get it. I live next door to mine. I know exactly what you're talking about. Right? So that's one piece of it. But what is that, Mary?
I think he's giving them some personal responsibility.
Aha, good insight. Say more.
Well, because even if it is, like when in the workplace and in your family, you're still personally responsible for your behavior and your relationship with God and what you can learn about that. And God's calling you. What's your responsibility? The ability to respond to God.
That's right. So we know Jesus, right? And Jesus is God. And that God can't perform a miracle in God's birth town. Hello? That's what's going on with that? Okay? Huh? Right? So that's the question is, so this now invites us to theological wondering about our role in relationship to God's activity in the world. So what do you think, Helen?
Well, I think he isn't meant to stay there. He's meant to go out.
Well, okay, that's one, right? And if he was just killing it on the miracles, he might not ever leave in his hometown, maybe, right?
Well, not just killing it on the miracles, but I mean, if they're not really hearing him,
right?
if they can't accept the fact that that Gentiles can go to heaven,
Right.
can be part of the kingdom of God, huh?
Or other Jews even, right? Good insight, Helen. Terry, what were you saying?
They don't have the faith in him.
Right. So part of what we know that Jesus is calling us to is co-creation, right? Co-participation. So how often do we see in the healings that Jesus says, your faith has made you well. Your co-participation in this. Now we know Jesus is the one that does it, right? But he's at with that blind with the woman, right, from Caesarea Philippi. The wealthy woman who comes down and gets healed, and the father, their faith or their belief is the thing that engages. And so if you take that out of the equation, even God can only do just a couple of small deeds of power, right? Yeah. What do you think, Liz?
Last time the woman who reached out and touched the cake because she thought maybe just touching that would make her.
Right, that faith, right?
She had faith.
And it says here, this is such a great line. Verse 5, chapter 6. And he could know, this is so interesting. I mean, you guys tell me what this means. And he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. So the question, right? So the question that I wonder about is, what is a deed of power that he couldn't do?
Raise somebody from the dead.
Well, that's a deed of power, when you raise somebody from the dead. That qualifies.
Says an act of God.
That's exactly right. Right, so a deed of power is an act of God. Right, so he may have been able to cure this person or that person because he was good at curing. He's pretty good at curing. Because he's
pretty good energy.
Because he's pretty good at curing, right? He's like a good doctor. Like he went to the right medical school and he's practiced long enough and he's good at this thing, right? But that's different than deed of power. And the deed of power is articulating that God is king. And it's opening that reality, right? So the thing I wonder about this very closed little community of Nazareth is that they didn't necessarily believe in God's power. Now that's paradoxical, isn't it? That can certainly not God's love, but they might not have even believed in God's power. Now, have you ever heard of a religious community that doesn't believe in God? They're probably all over the place, frankly, right? I mean, that's the point. There's all sorts of groups that sort of have a particular way of being or say something about what they believe about God, but it's really not about the power of God. It's about the power of the community and what they believe in their self-centeredness. And so I don't wonder if this little community that believed they were super religious, right? They were so religious they weren't even going to go to that crappy old synagogue over there. They were going to go to their own synagogue right here. That's how religious they were. They knew God better than anybody knew God, the many that gathered. So all of a sudden you can see that these guys aren't actually about the power of God. They're about the power of their own little community. And Jesus wasn't going to fit into that.
What
Right?
about his mother?
Uh-huh.
What about Mary? Wasn't there one person there that believed that?
She did hold all these things in her heart.
I just think it's such a
So that also is a clue, Julie, about the age of James. So Joseph isn't here, right? So Joseph probably piles older than Mary. Joseph's probably dead at this point, right? And so when Joseph dies, who's in charge?
The oldest son.
The oldest son, if what?
He's still.
No, if he's over 13,
Ah.
right? So we know that James is over 13. So now Mary might have handled this very differently if all those little kids that are being named here were under 13. She would say, hey, this is my son, right? But at this point, she was now under the authority of James. And James didn't say that. Now we do know later what happens. They come looking for Jesus, don't they? Right? They come down to Capernaum. So we'll get to that if we ever get out of chapter 6. I'm convinced we'll get out of chapter 6 because we're sort of clipping along now. But this idea now, so you can see how much is packed in this little thing, right? The insights that this give us about who this little community is, about their synagogue, right? Things that you could just sort of read over, but these are clues. Some of the words about how they describe themselves, some of the breaks in tension and energy. Right, the children, the age of the children, where the authority seems to lie or doesn't lie. So they see him just now as a guy that is good at curing this sick person or that sick person, but not as those healing gifts being deeds of power from God, because what he was doing wasn't fitting into their world. Martha, what do you think?
I'm back there somewhere with the power of deed of power thing. Can you refresh that? Just
The deeds of power?
Yeah, versus what this community, as a little community, was stuck on themselves. If they were religious, what were they doing?
Oh, so yeah, right. So if they were religious, why weren't they into the deeds of power? Well, maybe judgment trumped what God was doing. Maybe their interpretation of the law was more important than the reality of the Holy Spirit working in the world, right? I mean, have we ever heard of religious communities being so judgmental that they cast out their own children? Have you heard of that? Even today, right? Even after Jesus has come, people will use Jesus' name to cast out through judgment their own people. They're not interested in the deeds of power.
Well, so they're not interested in the co-participation.
And they can't be participatory in the right? And that's what we see here. So these are all clues about this community, right? About how insular they are and how really they're not interested. They want Jesus to run the world for them, not as an expression of the deeds of power. So at the end of the day, they just see him as a guy who can do healing, and he is amazed at their unbelief. Right? This super religious community is unbelieving. Wow. And then he leaves.
So, deeds of power mean that he was God. That is an act of God.
Well,
Correct?
I think deeds of power are always an act of God. However, I would also say the deeds of power don't have to be done exclusively by Jesus.
True.
Right? You can do deeds of power. Right? And we were all made to, because when the thing that we do, I preached about this a while ago, like recently a while ago, I think, represent the glory of God, right? Then we become the fullness of what our gifts are. If our gifts are held in sort of trust based on our own capacity or our own belief that we were the ones that did them for our own glorification, they are kept small. They're not deeds of power, Bill. Then they're just going around curing a few people. But if they're inflated by the power of God for the glory of God, then what we do, whatever we do, if it's painting a picture or teaching children or preaching a sermon, whatever it is, or putting together an airplane engine, right? Those can be deeds of power. Terry?
But is healing not a deed of God or a power of God? I don't understand the difference between healing and I don't understand why healing was not considered a deed of power.
So back to this idea. Healing can be a deed of power, but it doesn't have to be. So if a guy breaks his leg 2,000 years ago and somebody that doesn't know anything about God and doesn't believe in God splints it, is that a deed of power? Right? Or even heals them.
Because then there were other people who were healing.
Well, tons of people are healers, and there still are people that are healers, right? And that can look like a neurosurgeon, or it can look like, it can look like many things. The question is, are we participating as co-creators in giving the glory to God, right? So you can, right? So there's that's what's happening in this little section.
Do you think there's a little bit of self-doubt among the community because if they really truly see Jesus as one of them, as coming from them, his family's there and all, and yet they don't have the belief that he is the Son of God. So is there some self-doubt there that he's one of us, so how could he be the Son of God? Like the way they familiarize themselves and connect themselves to Jesus is not in that realm, is not to that level.
Yeah, that's right. Or they think more about themselves than God. So the fact that he does miracles and has been prophesied about and is so well educated, and they're still willing to kill him, means that they actually care less about God and more about him belonging to them. Does that make sense? We see that in Luke, right? So that also says something about that rigid little community, right? That they would kill one of them. Now what they couldn't do there, what do we see happen later? The world finally gets him, right? They finally kill him. But now it's not just that little town of 120, right, in the hills of Galilee. Now it's the Roman Empire that finally kills him, right? So it's almost as if the world can't stand the presence of God or the demand that God puts on our gifts, right? That we actually were given what we're given to share with God as opposed to hold for ourselves. It's like the world can't stand that we have been made and are linked to God that way. So I think that is that's what we see here as we pull apart work. So maybe we'll stop there, and next week go on to verse 7. We flew through that. We're really just
skipping a few things.
Really 5.5, but well, you don't want to. So yeah, we don't tell Steve we didn't clip along because he's gonna he always gives me a hard time. He's like, you're going pretty slow through this. So.
Well, you have to bring us along. I keep going back to some of these other things, and thank you very much for putting it all into context. Yeah.
It's an interesting book, right? It's a super interesting book, and it tells us a lot and about our world, right? Because we have all sorts of little Nazareths all over the place. And one thing I always think about our little parish here in Seattle is that we don't be a Nazareth. We're not like that, right? We try to be open when new ideas and new people come into our presence. Because otherwise it's about what we can do, not what God is doing through us. And that's a struggle. It's particularly a big struggle with competent people. The people who have been able to build their lives and run their lives the way they want to run them, right? For that community and for our community, because that's you, that makes it even harder to do it for the glory of God. Because frankly, it's working fairly well for you. For me, right? What do I need God? What do I need God for on this?
How can we dare be inclusive?
Or how can we dare be better than we already are? Yeah. Right? And I think that's the invitation to us.
This seems particularly important to me, translating in how we live our lives and make our decisions and get up in the morning, for example, and decide to do this and this and this. But is that for my glory, or is that actually what the Holy Spirit is guiding me to do? So thank you for
Thank you, Martha. And one of the reasons why we do the spiritual practices in Christianity is to start our day with prayer, and to think about, like, am I like front loaded to listen for the Holy Spirit? And prayer locates us in the present, and the present is right here, right now, and right here, right now is the kingdom of heaven, and that is where God is. So we front load to be present with God at any given moment, because when we're present with God at any given moment, we are ready for whatever comes on us, right? And then at the end of the day, we do a retrospective, right? You get to the end of the day and you pray and you look back. Was I ready for what the world was going to put upon me? Because I had a plan. I went out with a plan this morning. Looked at my calendar, and then all of a sudden it got shifted. Was I ready for the shift that God was calling me into? And then you look back, right? And that becomes a secular pattern of preparation and reflection, and over time we get better at being ready for what God puts at us. That's exactly right. All right, let's say prayer. It was stand up. I didn't even write on the board. Got a cramp in my leg. So hold hands. Come on, let's gather. Let's do this. Just like they did it in Nazareth. Maybe not. God of grace and God of glory, this is an extraordinary day, and you bring us together to think of the Bible, what it means and how it calls us to our best selves, how we are as a community, how we invite people in and we meet them where they are, and we learn what we see and we teach what we know. And when we do that, we live into the glory that you've put upon us, that may be represented in all the world in a way that is true and light and wonderful. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen.
I apologize for telling you didn't say anything to me on Wednesday night. I know I'm from dusk and will return.